nutrition is limited. You eat something, your body breaks it down into component molecules that, in the case of fats, kind of get broken down a lot and then reassembled. And then those circulate in your bloodstream. And yeah, they wash into your cells. Fine. But what creates these new molecules that have mood elevating, pain relieving, and anti-inflammatory effects is exercise. I would say 20% nutrition, 80% physical activity for health.
Hey everyone, what if I told you that regular exercise has the ability to transform your health, even if you subscribe to a not so balanced eating plan? No, that doesn't mean you should eat ultra-processed foods for every meal. We still believe in whole foods and a predominantly plant-strong diet at mindbodygreen, and that health begins on one's plate. But I do think today's guest is onto something when she says exercise is way more concrete than nutrition. Exercise is more important than we thought, and I encourage you to keep an open mind when listening to her point of view. Now to the show. Anastacia, welcome.
Thank you, Jason. I'm happy to be here.
It's great to have you. As I mentioned before we started to hit record, I receive a lot of pitches, but the title of your book, Eat Like a Pig, Run Like a Horse, How Food Fights Hijacked Our Health and the New Science of Exercise, grabbed my attention in a way that others do not. I was definitely intrigued and I started reading, and boy, what a fascinating subject and a powerful personal story. So it's just an honor to have you here.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I have to say that was, of course, a little intentional. It's a title that's meant to grab you by the collar. There are maybe some missing words in there because I think if I made it a little bit longer, I'd say, if you eat like a pig, then you better run like a horse.
So let's start. You have a very unique background. So let's start there and your own personal health journey, which led you to write this book.
So I, was like pretty much everybody else in their 20s, kind of focusing on 20s stuff, your career and love and so forth. And then sort of midway through, I had what was basically like a stroke. One side of my body went numb. I lost strength and I lost balance. And this was kind of right before MRIs were widely available. So I went to the neurologist, whose, believe it or not, name was Dr. Grimm. And Dr. Grimm informed me that there were three possibilities. Either what had happened to me was an anomaly, just would never happen again, that it was a brain tumor and that he would be seeing me shortly, or that it might be multiple sclerosis. So I did what was one possible response to a severe crisis, which is I ran away. I ran away to South America, and I basically kind of started a whole other life, which was a little bit more adventurous. I ended up founding and running an English language news magazine for several years. And I ended up moving from my first very serious boyfriend from college to another boyfriend. So I kind of redid it in all different ways. But then fate caught up with me, and I had a repeat attack. This time it was on the opposite side of my body. And again, I lost strength. I was unable to walk. I remember signing a check for a freelancer at this point, and my signature looked like chicken scratches because I couldn't hold the pen. And then then I was actually able to use one of I was living in Quito, and I made an exchange in my newspaper for 6 months of ads for use of their brand new MRI. And I went in, and they did an MRI. And at that point, the neurologist who had trained in Mexico, he said, "Oh, there's something you have that we don't see here, but I saw it in Mexico City, and it looks like you have multiple sclerosis because you have multiple lesions on your brain." So From then in, I kind of was incorporating that information into my life. I did exercise at that point, but I was more of a swimmer, and probably wasn't getting as sort of much of a cardio workout as I later did. But sort of fast forward a few more years, I had a few more what are called attacks, flare ups, exacerbations, whatever language you want to use. This time, primarily in my legs, that would just sort of affect sort of my ability to get around for a while. Um, and then in the middle of, I should also add, got married, moved back to the States, a bunch of other stuff. Started having kids. And then in the middle of my second pregnancy, uh, I was still swimming, and then one day while I was projectile vomiting, which sometimes happens when you're pregnant, I braced myself against the counter next to the toilet and twisted my shoulder so badly that I really screwed up my rotator cuff. I was in terrible pain and I couldn't swim anymore. And so as soon as I got a little bit more recovery in that, I headed out the door and started to do slow jogging. I kept that up through that pregnancy, after the pregnancy, and kept going. And then I started to notice after several years that my MS flare ups had stopped. And uh, in fact, I never had another one after I started running. So while I didn't immediately sort of say what's going on here over time, and over time, I began to wonder, what it was, if it was the exercise that was somehow protecting me from, progression with my disease, and if so, how that worked. So Eat Like a Pig, Run Like a Horse is my journey of discovery about how exercise can protect against all sorts of diseases and conditions.
So before we dive into some of the the data and the studies which you reference in the book supporting your theory that exercise is to some degree the ultimate elixir, um, how would you describe your philosophy on nutrition or diet in this period of time? How are you eating? Because everyone listening is asking that question.
That is a great, great question. And so I actually, during this time, I had started to become a food writer, and I was very interested. I've always been very interested in food, and but I was pretty much like the majority of people, which is I felt, I believe very strongly that only whole foods were healthy and that processed foods were bad and that I should be cooking everything from scratch. I had kids and I really actually tried to do that. One of my very first pieces was this kind of diatribe about Annie's mac and cheese on Salon, and which received a ton of very irate notes because I was saying that Annie's was basically the same thing as Kraft's. Because and that, but I was at the same time I was very frustrated as a mom because I remember my daughter, she just, even if I made it from scratch, she always preferred the Annie's, and that was kind of a blow.
Very similar ingredients. It wasn't like a huge step forward in terms of the ingredients for Annie's, if I remember that label. Yeah.
Exactly. There's very little, and at that time, I think Annie's was sort of implying that they were organic, and they weren't even organic. I think I can't remember. There was some sort of a term they used. So, but that piece also set me off into sort of an interest in industrial food. So these things were happening simultaneously. I became a slow food leader in my region, and I was, still advocating all this home cooking, and I member of a CSA, getting my vegetables. I was a member of a meat CSA for a while, and then at the same time, I was starting to write these pieces about industrial food and really getting into the food science behind it. Which led me to the topic of my first book, which is how the military has influenced the American diet because it invests in the food science research that ends up being incorporated into combat rations, and then that is spread to the industry.
So talk about, I think that's so interesting. Can we just pause there for a moment and talk about the military's influence around shelf life and all of the above?
Well, as you know, that's the topic of a whole other book, but I'm happy to talk about it. Yeah. So that was a really interesting journey. It literally started with a sandwich, which was, as I said, during this period, I was trying to make my kids healthy food, but I was also packing some lunches for school. And one day when I was doing that, I started to actually think about the things I was putting into what I considered my homemade sandwich, bread and cheese and this packaged deli meat. Um, and I realized, and mayo, and I said, okay, wow, these things actually, they last for a long time in my fridge or in my cupboard, and I wonder how that's happening, and really, are they that healthy? So after my daughters went off to school, I started to do research on those four different ingredients of the sandwich, and I went deep into the food science. And very weirdly, I found at the sort of origin of the extended shelf life for two of the items, the bread and the packaged deli meat, this reference to this thing called the Natick Soldier System Center, which is actually right near me in Massachusetts, and is the center where they do all the research on combat rations. And I was like, why? What's the military doing in our food? I could not understand it. And that led me to unravel this whole real policy, which is to either do or fund food science research into extended shelf life and food safety, so that combat rations, which must be able to last for up to 3 years at room temperature in their packaging, will be safe. And so, because the military wants that, either for the food industry to be able to quickly shift their uh, production lines into combat rations, if there's ever sort of a big global war, they they just kind of disseminate that, free, so that it gets out there. And they also work with these big companies to encourage them to create products based on that technology. And so that system has created sort of this throughput of military funded food research that then is very quickly incorporated into our cupboards.
So does this date back to World War II, I'm assuming?
It does go back to World War II, yes, because it was so huge, and the need was so great to provide so many rations to so many soldiers around the world.
Well, on one hand, you do in the book say that, you know, processed food, maybe we've wrongly vilified processed food to some degree, but at the same time, before we go there, you do talk about the difference, and I think this is notable, between the EU and America in terms of legally accepted additives. EU's kicking our butt.
Yes, they are much stricter. But at the same time, I did find, in the more recent book, in Eat Like a Pig, Run Like a Horse, that there's really only a small number of additives that are not uh, allowed in the EU that are allowed in the US. Anyway, the bigger picture was I got a very, very close look at processed food, what goes into it, why it's made the way it is, and really kind of the two really key concepts here are, as you mentioned, the being shelf stable, so being able to last for a long time, and so it has to be safe, but it also has to be able to kind of maintain its tastiness, which is something called shelf stability. And so there are ingredients that are there to make it safe, and there are also ingredients there to just make sure it's shelf stable.
But, building off of that, I think we're aligned in that we're cautious around processed food. But at the same time, if we can collectively agree on a working definition of what's healthy, in the book you talk about ranging from Michael Pollan's Eat Food Not Too Much, Mostly Plants, to vegan, keto, paleo, Mediterranean, the list goes on. But in summary, it is a mostly whole foods diet. There's some processed foods there. And if we can establish that as relatively healthy for the average person, I think what I thought was so interesting, the point, what I got from your book was we should just probably let it go. And that the missing link here is not in food, it is in exercise. So walk me through that journey while you're exploring all the different diets and the culture and the ideology and everything that goes along with it and the science. Walk me through that where you're looking through the literature and you're walking away saying, I don't see it in food here.
Yeah, well, so that kind of starts right back there in my journey with the military, which is as I went through that process, I started to see that a lot of times I think the consumer feels uncomfortable about processed food. Well, let me back up. People will basically try and eat whatever they see all around. That's kind of our history. We've like figured out how to eat the craziest things. We eat, plant, uh, vegetable, mineral. We figure out all weird ways to process it, and we're always coming up with new ways to eat food. So in that sense, the uh, processed food is really just kind of a step further in human evolution of eating. I think what happens is that people become very uncomfortable around the science and technology that goes into that because they don't understand it very well. And so it feels very scary because there may be chemicals or there may be, weird physical processes that are happening, and they're not intuitive. So I think that has created this sense of fear around it because people don't know what's happening. But as I started to look more closely at it, for example, some of these additives, they sound terrible, but some of them are, they're secreted by bacteria in the lab, and they're weird little thickeners. And okay, yeah, it's not, maybe it wasn't something that was used 200 years ago, but the concept of, consuming the secretions of, microbes is something that is something historic. And in other cases, we've created synthetic alternatives. So I started to become a lot more tolerant of those things based on my feeling of knowledge and understanding of what scientists were doing. So that was one piece of it. And the second piece is there's actually a bridge book between my two books, which is going to be coming out next year. Things like that happen in the publishing world. Um, so that book is really will show you how I moved from this whole thing of understanding of processed food in my research on the military to the belief that we needed to pay more attention to physical activity. And in that, I do examine, and I'm glad you brought this up. There's a system for classifying all foods so that we better understand which categories of processed foods are maybe only consumed as treats and which ones we can really include in our diets and not worry too much about. And so in going through that, I would I would basically can say, the things that we have in our cupboards most of the time for example, one of my favorite or during when my kids were little, one of their favorite meals was also all from processed food. It was spaghetti sauce, spaghetti, and grated cheese. When you think about those are all highly processed foods, but they're fairly healthy. So things like that, frozen dinners, yay canned vegetables. There are lots of things that are processed that are pretty good for us. So there is one small category which would tend to fall into that classification that people now use of ultra processed. And yes, that should be consumed in moderation as a treat, as you would any other treat, sweets or alcohol or whatever. And in general, that kind of food, it kind of gets broken down into its component molecules and really reassembled in a way that it's really hard to kind of figure out what it might have been originally. And that's bad for us only in that it's so easy to digest and a very quick way to accumulate calories. So
So, what's an example of something ultra processed?
like chips, your candies, pretty much anything that's super naughty that you can think of that you'd like to snack on. That's an ultra processed food.
The other thing I'll point out too, within the processed food world, one, I think it happens. We all have processed food, no matter how hardcore we are. And I do think where we are today, and there's so many better options out there uh, across the board. You mentioned pasta. I have lentil pasta. It's just lentils, lentil flour. It's amazing. Great source of protein. Uh, it's processed, but if I look at the ingredients, that's it. It's just lentils. There's great sauces. There's just better everything. But with regards to the villains, so to speak, um, you know, it, in your research, I'm assuming, did you came across studies that supported some generalizations like we should probably avoid too much processed sugar, refined sugar, excuse me, processed meat. Like what were, if we're looking for this definition of reasonably healthy, uh, let's come back to that. And what are the things we should probably generally avoid before we segue?
From Combat Ready Kitchen, I would say go easy on the processed meats. There's definitely some good signs to show that in I think if you're using those regularly, you should maybe rethink that. There is clearly, if you're guzzling soda or juice or fruit juice all day long, that's not good because you're just ingesting tons of calories. And there's a bunch of science that shows that you're you don't feel as full. Soda, so no, soda and fruit juice, no. And then I say, yes, eat lots of vegetables. Vegetables are great. But once you have met your basic nutritional requirements, and this is the point of eat like a pig and like a horse, there's really not much to be gained by following any special diet. And by basic nutritional requirements, I mean protein, fat, some carbohydrates, maybe better if they're complex carbohydrates, vitamins and minerals. Um, so there's a lot of leeway there.
You talk about Ansel Keys, who is a figure who has been widely discussed in our space. Can you talk about Keys and the various food fights we've been having amongst ourselves in the wellness world, debating his work?
I would love to. Before I go on to that, I just wanted to finish up your question because you wanted to know how I got to the physical activity. So then I started. Then I was like, okay, well, if processed food is not that bad, then what's going on? What accounts for this global increase in obesity and the global increase in lifestyle diseases, which are also called non-communicable diseases? And all of a sudden, I started to see, this emerging body of research on the effects of sedentarism. And then I can look at just simply in, sort of historical records of activity patterns in the U.S. government. That our activity level has just slowly been decreasing, while at the same time we're just spending more and more time, frankly. What we're doing right now is interacting with screens. So once I started to look at that, then I said, okay, well, maybe it's the lack of movement, of physical activity that is a factor here. And so that led me off in this direction. And now on to Ansel Keys.
Yes, I just want to close on Keys with food and go back to exercise because I think it's so interesting.
Ansel Keys is a looming scientific figure of the 20th century. He again appeared in my first book because he founded the K ration, which was kind of ironically enough the first snacking or grazing ration because it was like a Slim Jim and a little some crackers and some chocolate. Um, but he was also he was a physiologist, and he was interested in all other sorts of issues to do with the body, to fatigue and sleep and altitude. During the war, he operated a laboratory at the University of Minnesota, where he did a very, very famous experiment on conscientious objectors, where they were essentially used as guinea pigs to see what the effect of what he assumed was going to be happening in Europe, which is there are many large populations of people were not getting enough to eat, and he wondered what the impact of starvation would be. So he had these guys starve themselves, and this was had some very unpleasant effects for them. Some of them lifelong, by the way, because they became food obsessed after this experience. But what he did notice was that they had this tremendous drop in their blood cholesterol. So after the war, and I should say a little piece of this is that during World War II, the use of tobacco in cigarette form increased dramatically. It almost doubled. One of the reasons was actually that the cigarette companies, because they were trying to get people to use cigarettes instead of pipes and so forth that they had used before, began to distribute cigarettes with soldiers' rations. So that got at this whole new generation of Americans hooked on tobacco. After World War II, there was this huge increase in this spike in the number of people who are having heart attacks and cardiovascular disease. And so people were wondering why that was and speculating about as to the causes. And there's research being done on it. And Keyes then said, okay, well, let's see. And sort of, if you starve people and their blood cholesterol drops, and people already had this idea that cholesterol was associated with cardiovascular problems, maybe if they have too much cholesterol, then that will increase their risk. And so he proposed doing an international study comparing different populations to see the impact of what the impact of their diet might be on their health. In order to do this kind of a study, you do like a pilot. And so during the 1950s, Keyes was doing these pilots around the world, and it wasn't a study that was funded by any one funder because it was international, and so he looked for a variety of funding sources. And one of them ended up being the tobacco industry. So what was interesting about that, and it was not a huge amount of money, but what was interesting about that is what the tobacco industry wanted from Keyes. What they wanted was for him to show through his population studies that tobacco use was not the important risk factor for cardiovascular disease. And Keyes did, in fact, do that, in that he showed by comparing different populations, he showed that had variable cholesterol levels and levels of heart disease. He speculated that that was caused by these differences in fat in their diet. So he looked at Japanese, and he looked at Scandinavians, and he looked at Mediterraneans, and he found overall that the ones who lived in the Mediterranean were the healthiest. What he didn't really include in all of this was that there were very variable levels of physical activity among his populations, and that for example, and some of those populations perhaps had much less access to cars because they were, for example, Italians tended to, move around on foot, and then there were also variable levels of smoking. So he kind of just focused on the diet piece and dropped out those two other pieces. And at the same time, because the smoking didn't seem to be at all correlated with heart disease, or I should say, was confounded by the diet, the tobacco industry was then able to say, well, this famous scientist, he looked at the issue of smoking, he found there's really no correlation, that's really diet. And so I believe, and I was unable to actually find the smoking gun here, but I'm pretty sure that they helped place that seminal article in Time magazine, which was in, I think, in 1960 or in early 1961, which was where um, Key's research broke through to the public and really definitively finding that high cholesterol in the diet caused cardiovascular disease. And from there, he was very famous, very influential, and other voices really dropped out. There was somebody, he had sort of a countervailing um, influence in Britain, who was a Scottish epidemiologist who had done research that found that cardiovascular disease was caused by a lack of activity. And the way he did this was he looked at the two different kinds of double bus employees. The double buses they have in London and so forth. And he found that the drivers who were sitting all day were had a much higher rates of cardiovascular disease than the conductors who walked up and down the stairs and the aisles and collected tickets all day. But Jeremy Morris, it was his name. But those voices really got sort of outshouted, let's say, by Keyes and his crew, and then sort of momentum gathered behind that interpretation, and really the whole sort of understanding of cardiology and cardiovascular disease and good nutrition became founded on that rather than anything to do with exercise or smoking.
Well, you've also mentioned around the same time, Eisenhower, who was the president, had a heart attack and he ate a lot of red meat, but he was also a chain smoker.
Yes, 4 packs a day. I mean, and it's interesting because the news articles of the time, his cardiologist is saying he's got to go on this diet, blah blah blah. He doesn't mention the smoking.
So I think the bigger point and why I wanted to come back to Keyes before we fully move on to exercise is, in my view, it's an extreme example of many of the issues we have with these nutrition studies where you're really not controlling the group. In my view, it's an extreme example of the issue we have with some of these large scale nutrition studies where you really don't have control of the group. Uh, you ask someone a question, did you did you eat fast food? And the answer is no, but then they went to Jack in the Box. It wasn't McDonald's. That's maybe not the best example, but I'll use it. What else are they doing in their day? Whereas exercise is a little bit more clear here.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, nutrition, first of all, the nutrition studies are sort of an exercise in muddying the waters because a lot of times, as people may or may not know, they are funded by industry or they're funded by people who are trying to kind of push a particular agenda. So it's very difficult to understand. But I think what an interesting thing that uh, you're bringing up is who or what are these studies done on? And one of the most common subjects are mice and rats in the laboratory, and that, as you know, is the subject of a whole chapter in my book because one of the most fascinating things about laboratory research is it's done on subjects that are pretty much uh, held captive and not allowed to move because laboratory rodents are kept in these very tiny boxes called shoebox cages, which sounds about, is the description that is about the size of a shoebox. And in the wild, mice and rats would, of course, have a much bigger space. They would be able to burrow. They would be living with other animals. And most importantly, they would have the ability to run about and move about as freely. It turns out that even in the wild, laboratory mice will run sort of between 4 and 8 miles a day. These little tiny animals. So if the question then becomes, if you're using these kinds of animals that have this enforced sedentarism as your research subjects, you can do all kinds of nutritional research on them, but since they're not actually moving around, you don't really know what the impact of that would be in a normal movie, mobile animal body.
And so when you're going down and looking at all of the research, what stands out to you in this process where you say, wow, we're really overlooking this? It really is exercise and not diet.
Wow, there are actually so many things. I mean, literally, this issue with the, laboratory animals, it's just super confounding because um if exercise is vitally important to animal health and you're doing nutritional and, obesity and all sorts of, disease studies on animals that are being kept immobile, how meaningful are the results of, much of the research of the last century and this one? Because none of those animals have been able to move around unless they're in an exercise protocol. So that in of itself, I said, "Wow, maybe we have to throw out all of that because we don't really know what it would be like to let's say eat, an sea slug extract when you're also active as your body is meant to be." So, you know, th really each piece of the book has just, something that makes that case very strongly. Um, the other issue, we could talk about, for example, um, people the difference between fatness and fitness, which is something people have looked at, and I know, when we were
Yes,
chatting beforehand, you
let's
mentioned.
let's look at that. Yeah.
Yeah, let's look at that. So, one of the things that people think is that they have to get slim to be healthy. But there's been, a fair amount of research looking at the issue of fat versus fit. And what in one of those was I said in the book, which is a guy named Glenn Gaser at the University of Arizona, and what he did is sort of meta study, reviewing all sorts of studies and looking at the impact of fat of fitness in each BMI category. So that would be from underweight, normal weight, overweight, and obese. And what he found was that within each category, the fit people were always much healthier than their unfit counterparts, and that from BMI category to BMI category, there's actually not that much difference in the fit people in each group. So the meaning of that is that if you are overweight or obese and fit, you can still be healthy. And that's just such a amazing message for a world in which we are focusing on how much weight people need to lose.
Well, walk us through how we define fit in that scenario.
Okay, so fit would be, and I'm not sure exactly how it was defined in in this meta study. You can look at that in different ways. The most scientific way has to do with the maximum amount of oxygen that you can use during exercise. And if you can get up to certain levels, then you are considered fit. Other times, people use sort of a shoe-in. They will kind of ask you to record how much exercise you do and whether it's moderate or vigorous during the week, as a measure for fitness.
So essentially, it's looking at cardiovascular fitness.
Yes,
And so there was if I recall, there was like a chart
right.
in the book. Can you just kind of visually walk us through that? I think that was a good way to kind of look at it.
Yeah, so that was the chart I was just referring to with the fat versus fit. So there are 2, it looked at, mortality for overall mortality and cardiovascular mortality, and there were these, 3 different BMI categories. the normal weight, the overweight, and the obese for each one of those. And in within that, um, there was they looked at fit and unfit people in each category. And the fit people always had a much better mortality rate than the unfit people in both overall deaths and cardiovascular deaths.
Interesting. So, coming back to the bigger question, what is it about exercise? What's happening on a physiological, metabolic, molecular, cellular level that is making it so powerful?
One of the interesting things is I like to think that people have this idea that when you eat and you have this special diet that there's going to be these molecules just going to right into your cells and do something wonderful. Um, and that's kind of a misconception. And you can take in whatever kind of molecules you want, but nothing's going to happen in those cells with those molecules unless you exercise. And so, uh, what happens when you exercise is that it stresses your mitochondria, which are the parts of your cell that create energy. And to be able to supply the energy to your muscles, the mitochondria have to work at a much higher rate than they do when you're just kinda sitting around. And it's up to 50 times, and it just changes. So you have to imagine all of a sudden you're going from sort of steady state and to an increase where your blood is circulating 4 times as fast. Your breathing is increasing, and glucose, which is the fuel for your body cells, is going into your cells at a rate that's 50 times faster than normal. And uh, the mitochondria are producing energy, at a rate that again is 50 to 100 times faster. Everything's just vastly speeded up. Um, so those processes, they, for one thing, a really amazing scientific discovery made sort of at the turn of the 21st century was that um, exercise itself opens up a second pathway for glucose to get into your cells. Now, this is the problem that when you have diabetes is that you can't get glucose into your cells, even though you increase the amount of insulin. So the fact that you can get glucose in without insulin means that you can regulate your blood sugar levels. For example, if you have diabetes, or prevent diabetes because you're getting the glucose into your cells. At the metabolic level, what happens is that the the increase in the mitochondrial functioning puts a lot of stress on the cell. It increases the amount of heat that's there, so the cell has to out a way to dump that heat, and that in and of itself creates these new molecules. Some one has to do with like making speeding up the rate, and the others have to do with re sort of saving heat stressed or stressed molecules, protein molecules, and those molecules then remain in the body in a much elevated rate, and then because they have um, anti-inflammatory impacts, they're then there to like affect, for example, in my case, maybe they're affecting my MS inflammation.
So, you mentioned you became a runner. So, I'm curious, what type of exercise and how do you think about frequency and duration? What is optimal? What is the ultimate exercise diet, if you will?
Well, it has to do with what I mentioned. That process where you're getting out of breath and you need to take in more air because your mitochondria are functioning at such a high rate. That's what you want. So anytime you get out of breath and your heart rate goes up, that's the sign that you're in the zone and you're getting exercise that's going to have these, anti-inflammatory, sort of pain relieving and mood elevating impacts. If I personally would say you want to have, that kind of exercise for at least 20 minutes a day. And then you can round out your diet with other sorts of things with, which all have good impacts as well with, building strength, working on balance, and so forth. But yeah, at the core, you need aerobic exercise 20 minutes a day.
So essentially, it's what people would call zone two training, where you have an elevated heart rate where it's somewhat difficult to hold a conversation because you're out of breath. And that could be achieved from a fast paced walk to taking a whole host of stairs to strength training really fast to jumping rope to jogging. You can get there a million different ways, but it's this idea of slightly being out of breath.
Absolutely. That's it. And sweating. Sweating's a lovely sign too.
Oh, really? Sweating.
Oh, yeah, because that's the heat, because one of our the one of the things that increases these molecules in the body is the heat stress and the need to dissipate that heat. So if you're sweating, that's a sign that, you're heating up and that's good.
So I'm assuming you'd be a fan of saunas.
No. Because you have to think about the process. That's really heat at the surface of your body, and it's just trying to get rid of it, whereas when you're talking about heat that's coming from muscle cells being worked, that's coming from within your muscle cells, and that's what creates the anti-inflammatory molecules.
Got it. Got it. So I want to bring it back to the rodents, if you will. And the problem with those studies and that many of the rodents are just sitting around doing nothing. And humans, well, unfortunately, some humans are like that these days, but not really a reflection of how most people live their lives. But you mentioned studies in the book about cats and bats, which I don't really hear about on this show or in our world. So can you talk about what you learned from cats and bats?
Yeah, okay. Well, cats, cats are really kind of our sort of a measure of our own lives because they kind of mimic ours. But what I kind of noticed was that I a lot of my friends and neighbors have indoor cats, which is the recommendation of veterinarians today, for their own safety. But I did notice that a lot of my friends' indoor cats were super roly-poly. Um, and my cat, who's an outdoor cat and, is not, although she does chunk up a little in the winter. And so I kind of started meditating on that and went down the cat, rabbit hole, so to speak. And I started talking to vets and then they confirmed that there's, so many more, uh fat indoor cats than outdoor cats. And so that kind of suggested to me that the impact, on animals is kind of the same as it is for us. And in terms of health, there's some work that has been done that shows that that cats that get access to the outdoors and can exercise enough are healthier as our dogs. Bats
Yeah, bats, cats and bats.
Cats and bats are amazing. So bats, of all the animals in the book, are probably the most amazing athletes. It turns out that bats, when they go out to forage for flies or fruit, depending on the kinds of bats they are taking enormous journeys. Like they can be anywhere from sort of 8 miles a night, depending on kind of bat, to 50 miles a night. And so, the interesting thing, I kind of got onto the bats topic because of COVID. At first, I sort of, I was like, "Oh my god, people are gonna blame bats because there's that whole thing about the lab," and I was like, "Oh, they're gonna start killing bats," and I said sort of in my head, I was like, "Maybe I can show bats are good things." And so I started but I was also very curious because I said, "Okay, we're getting this horrible disease from bats, but bats are fine, so what's going on there?" So I kind of was looking at that angle. And I went and I kind of started to study more about bat metabolism. And it turns out that bats have this really unique metabolism because of that flight that they're doing, that motion, flapping their wings. It consumes a huge amount of energy, and so they have a very high metabolism, which is fueled slightly differently than ours. But the interesting thing about their heat goes up quite high. It increases a couple degrees. And so bats have this whole system for dissipating heat, but they also have really high levels of one of the molecules I was talking about earlier, something called molecules, heat shock proteins, excuse me. And these are protective again against inflammation. And bats have a whole other sets of processes that protect against inflammation. Um, but the result is that in bats in the wild, you can't tell the difference between a 25-year-old bat, and bats, yes, live that long sometimes, and a 2-year-old because they don't age.
Wow.
They don't age, and and they basically stay healthy until the very, very end.
So that's the secret. Is that the secret of the bats? They're constantly
Yeah,
moving.
I think the secrets of the bats is this they are endurance athletes to the max. They spent it like, I think one of the scientists in the book, he says that they're like, butt kicking bouts of exercise every day. It's not something we'd have to do like 4 ultra marathons to compete, but it's just an insane amount of physical activity, and it keeps them, just really their metabolic and immune systems are incredible.
Another interesting piece of research in the book, the Jackson Laboratory, excuse me. I thought that was really interesting. Can you talk about that one?
Oh boy. Yeah. So Jackson Labs was something that uh, came out of sort of the early genetics when people were looking for some creatures to do research on, and were so they began to the lab in the 1920s and began to develop all these different strains of mice, which were at first they were simply mated with their siblings to create sort of genetically similar individuals. Then eventually nowadays we do that, through genetic manipulation. But so the Jackson Labs developed all these different strains of mice that have been used all around the world in science. But at the same time, because they're sort of like the gold standard for laboratory animals, um, everything else about their process has also been copied, including how they keep their rodents. And how they keep their rodents is in these shoebox cages, which are very small. And they do not have access to a running wheel, so that they could like move around at all during the day. And so that in of itself has created this sort of, as said before, this sort of um, world where these very sedentary animals are then experimented on. And they are, scientists have noticed that they are also, these kinds of animals do tend to get obese, they tend to have more lifestyle diseases and so forth. So there is that impact on their bodies as well.
I come back to this idea that exercise is paramount. Uh, if you have some general understanding of nutrition, if you are eating well to some degree, and I can't help but think of your story around the tobacco industry and the role that the tobacco industry played in the 60s uh, in shaping a view around cholesterol, which was possibly inaccurate, uh, suffice to say. And I think of where we sit in the world today And I think we know where things ended with tobacco and where we stand with tobacco. And I think of the role of pharma.
Oh, yes.
And I'm not anti-pharma, but I think pharma is playing a role here. I got a big oh yes. So let's talk about that.
That yeah, I that's not actually something I've covered, but I definitely it's in the background. And yeah, I think the pharmaceutical industry, I think, had quite a bit to do with helping to create and define the obesity epidemic with the goal of having a new illness to create medicine for.
Yes. Yes.
You know that. And I there's Catherine Flegel, who's one of the scientists I talk about in the Food Fights chapter, has done quite a bit of research on this. I also did it for my for something else. And so there's this whole process during the 1990s, really, where there was this redefinition of things that before had been considered fine and acceptable. One of them was there was a finding by um, the CDC that there was an epidemic of overweight that was causing problems. Now, um, this was it turns out that the association with cardiovascular disease and death was greatly exaggerated. But that sort of was trumpeted and that turned into this clarion call for action to be taken. The pharmaceutical industry helped fund, for example, study groups for different organizations, including World Health Organization, where scientists were looking at whether they should, first of all, uh, adopt BMI as a measure of obesity, and then second of all, lower the thresholds for obesity and overweight, which they did. So that happened in the late 1990s. There was sort of a decision. Okay, let's lower the BMI for obesity from I think it was 27 to 25, and sort of overnight millions of people became fat. Um, then there's just the idea that rather than looking at other issues, rather than working on, for example, physical activity, that we're going to medicate obesity um, out of existence. And there was, while this whole process on medicalization of obesity was happening, and I also want to mentioned that it continued during the early 2000s, and then in 2000 and I think it was 12 or 13, the American Medical Society Association came out and endorsed the idea that obesity was a disease that then, of course, would need to be treated.
Yeah, talk about that for a moment. That's an important distinction in this. Once you be classified as disease, different game.
Yes, exactly, and
Because
this is
disease equals drug.
exactly,
Something's
exactly.
classified
So
as disease.
they were so yeah. So in I think it was 2012, and this was something that came out, and this another little tangled thread is the association the of endocrinologists. Now, endocrinologists are the branch of medicine that deals with hormones. Hormones are very similar to drugs, so there's kind of a lot of overlap. And in fact, the pharmaceutical industry of all the different medical specialties, the endocrinologists receive the most funding from the pharmaceutical industry. So, um, the interesting thing is that I'm probably gonna get a lot of hate mail after this.
All good. Not from our audience. You're preaching the
Okay, from
choir here.
endocrinologists for sure. But anyway, so they helped push this through, and they worked in their own association, and then they presented it at the American Medical Association meeting, and then there was the American Medical Association's own committees had considered the issues and recommended against it. And then there was sort of an outcry, and sort of they forced them to kind of relook at it, and then they passed the motion declaring obesity to be a disease. But until then, so once that happened, that really sets up the motion the wheels so that, yes, this is, wait for it, you can then have insurance, and particularly government insurance, pay for its treatment. And I promise you that this has all come to pass. Just read the New York Times this year, where they are saying, oh, yay, we now have some great new drugs to treat obesity. And people are going and they're complaining to their physicians if they're not being allowed to take these obesity medicines, which are covered by insurance.
It's such a travesty.
Yeah. When if they only focused on being healthy, which you can be at any weight, then they could, start exercising. The cool thing about exercise is the very first time you do it, you're going to have a good impact on your body. You don't need to lose a pound.
It's just so concerning on so many levels. And I'll caveat with I'm not a conspiracy theorist, and COVID happened. And I think of the conversation around vaccines, and vaccines were important, but I think we're still learning a lot about that. What was missing from the message in 2020, when things were doom and gloom and people were losing their lives, was completely absent the conversation around nutrition and exercise. When we know if you had a healthy body weight and you had a strong immune system, you were a lot more likely to be okay when you inevitably, well, now we know, inevitably got COVID. And that conversation was not even a conversation. And I go back to the why, because it wasn't in the interest of pharma to some degree. And here we are with obesity. It's scary.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, I mean, I've had all the vaccine, but I have been exposed to COVID. I think I've had COVID, but I haven't had any symptoms of COVID. And there is actually been research to show that people who are fitter and people who exercise were better able to resist COVID, and had better outcomes when they did.
Yes.
Absolutely. And again, goes back to these anti-inflammatory molecules that we're talking about.
So how do you see this playing out with, obesity is a disease, pharma's got a drug, pharma is
I think Pharma
very
won.
influential, yeah, and
I
and
think
here and
Pharma
here we
won.
are. But like we can't let them.
No, that's also we're talking about. So all those people, I just wish, it's so tragic, because I think the focus on losing weight is just harmful for everyone. It's harmful for, it's harmful for so many different reasons. One of which you're creating this situation in which people are living stigmatized and in shame for their bodies. But if they could just kind of focus on getting out there and, exercising enough every day, they're going to be healthy. They're going to feel better, and we can, improve outcomes without doing anything else. Instead, because people are focused on losing weight, they are being driven into these, sort of this pharmacological treatment of this situation, which, I'm not going to even, I would never call it an illness. So it's really heartbreaking, because a lot of people it's creating, a lot of unhappiness and unhealthiness.
Just to build off of that, I do think that's such a critical message, in that everyone differs with regards to what's healthy in terms of their BMI, depending on their level of cardiovascular fitness, defined as, this whole host of tests to see, I guess, your lung capacity to a certain degree. But, if you are doing that zone 2 training as we defined every day, and you're building that muscle, if you will, doesn't really matter what size you are to some degree. And we've completely we're not looking at that at all. We're just looking at BMI.
Exactly. No, if I mean, think about it. When you go to the doctor's office, there's no measure for how fit you are. Does your doctor ask?
Mike, I do all sorts of crazy work. So I do the 28 vials of blood, and I get the cardiovascular scan. I'm the extreme end of this, given who I am and my role at mindbodygreen and my passion for the space. But yeah, it's usually you go to a doctor and we do blood pressure, cholesterol, which is becoming meaningless.
Exactly. So I mean, if there were even, you could even do sort of a screening test to find out. My doctor knows I run because I tell her, but she doesn't say to me, how many minutes a week do you do vigorous exercise or moderate exercise?
In my view, lifestyle is paramount. Your genes are not your destiny, and exercise plays a significant role. And I want to come back to food, because food plays a role. Um, we've all heard, let food be thy medicine. Um, in your opinion, how far can food take us? Where does food fit in your ranking of lifestyle tools?
Thank you for that question. Yeah, I'm definitely advocating that we rewrite that to be let exercise be thy medicine. I hope I've made my case. But again, it's just sort of the actual physiology of it. Nutrition is limited. You eat something, your body breaks it down into component molecules that, in the case of fats, kind of get broken down a lot and then reassembled. And then those circulate in your bloodstream. And yeah, they wash into your cells. Fine. But what creates these new molecules that have, mood elevating, pain relieving, and anti-inflammatory effects is exercise. And in fact, some of the molecules that a pharmaceutical company will try and invent, it looks to these exercise induced molecules and the pathways in which they act when it's creating new substances for this. It doesn't look to food molecules. So that can't bring us very far. So in terms of, I'm the daughter of a statistician, so I'll break it down. I'm going to estimate this. I would say 20% nutrition, 80% physical activity
Wow.
for health. And then, yeah, of course, there sleeping is good. Those things are all. I'm just doing exercise and physical activity because those do factor in for sure. And mental health and sleep are super important. Also affected by exercise.
So you also were very intentional with your title, "Eat Like a Pig," because you were being literal in that pigs are omnivores, from my understanding.
Yes. Yes, that's true. Yeah, so the title has those 3 meanings. I already talked about the first one. If you eat like a pig, then you better run like a horse. The second level has to do with the animals mentioned in the books, and those 2 animals are the ones that are most like humans on those 2 spectrums. So pigs are omnivores. They eat whatever they see, just like us. And they actually have very similar digestive systems and metabolic systems, even similar sort of blood levels of the different nutrients. And so they're kind of our model on the eating end. And horses, like us, are the champion long distance runners and sweaters of the animal kingdom. And the fact that they sweat and we sweat is not a coincidence. It's because sweating is really one of the best ways to dissipate excess heat. And that allows us to be these incredible athletes. One final thing is just I think it's sort of a lean in message. I think you should do, if you're going to do something, you should do it to the max. So pigs and horses.
And I want to bring it back to your journey with MS, and there are lots of people with MS. Someone we've had on the show is a friend, Terry Walls, who I'm sure you're familiar with. And she has the Walls protocol, which goes into great detail outlining the food, medication, exercise, everything. And what's so interesting is when I first met Terry, God, it was like eight years ago, the medical community, really didn't acknowledge her at all. And that seems to have changed. Uh, with regards to MS, eh, what's your take on the medical establishment, if you will? And are we making strides there in acknowledging other things besides pharmaceuticals?
I think a little bit, there's been a little bit more attention paid to things besides the pharmacological solutions. I will caution that MS seems to be sort of a catch-all category because there's so many different types of MS out there and cases. So it's even hard to say, with certainty that it's the same disease. And even at the end of my book, I have this other possible autoimmune disease to consider. So, I really couldn't say, but I do feel that there's been a little bit more. I certainly have noticed some attention now to uh, MS patients who also run and the impacts of that. And there's been some more research on the impacts of exercise as time goes on. So yeah, little baby steps.
So you mentioned mental health, and when I think about exercise, specifically running, for so many people, it is a stress reliever. It is meditation and motion, and there's that added benefit where one's able to just clear their head from any worry they might have. And so I'm curious, for you, do you attribute part of the success you've had with running uh, as a tool for self care?
Absolutely. I mean, I think like many runners, I notice like I can get down on a day I don't go out. I really feel I need that. It helps me to, feel cheerful, um, energetic, and positive. And, I talk in the book a little bit about my daughter, my middle daughter, who during the pandemic, who she's an athlete, and she ended up just staying in her room all the time. She tacked like blankets over her windows so she wasn't even getting any light. And then she went through a really major depression. It was very scary. And I remember trying to get her to just go outside and do a little exercise, trying to get her to run, and she wouldn't do it. But yeah, exercise is just so important for mental health.
How's she doing now? Better?
She is doing great. Yeah, she got through that, but it was a super tough period as it was for so many kids and grown-ups.
Yeah, there are many unintended consequences of COVID, but I think a lot about children. We were kind of lucky in that our kids were a bit younger. My 2 year old, well, she's 3. She won't really remember it, maybe, and my 6 year old will to some degree, but largely unaffected. But I think about the kids who were older, uh, being at home, not being at school, devices, the explosion of TikTok, uh, all of the above. And I think of the mental health epidemic, and I just really feel for kids.
No, there's definitely a mental health epidemic at this point. I mean, it really, the kids are having issues, grown-ups, adults are having issues. Um, there aren't enough providers for everyone at this point. We have to get on that too.
There's so much noise in our space, in health in general. What's your biggest pet peeve when is it the well, I'll stop there. What's your biggest pet peeve?
It's the diet thing. It annoys the out of me. I get super annoyed by people who demonize certain foodstuffs. The sugar police really bug me, making it into this evil thing that, having people going on detoxes, yeah, and, touting different sort of nutritional study every week. I find it, all the noise really, I find it distracting. I literally think it's harmful for people. I think that, you know, if people just stopped paying attention to it and they just started to go, go bicycling every day, they would be in so better shape. I feel that their lives being lost because of this. So it's not just a pet peeve. I'm actually really serious. I think they're doing damage.
Yeah, I think most people in our space probably, and when I speak of the experts, probably agree on 80%, and they find themselves arguing about the 20. And on that note, I would say probably one of my biggest pet peeves is the magic silver bullet, if you will, that there's always just this one thing that's going to revolutionize your life, or the one thing that's going to make you feel better. And look, sometimes that does happen in rare circumstances, but I think for the most part, it's alchemy. There are many things, some of them we know, many of them we have no comprehension of.
Yeah, definitely.
On that note, how have you wrapped your head around your journey with MS? And where you are today in your search of, you know, exercise works. uh, and it, and this is what maybe caused it, or I don't know what caused it, or exercise works and I'm kind of gonna just forget about. Walk us through your journey and how you've kind of wrapped your head around everything, because you've gone through a lot.
In terms of MS, I think I'm stuck where my neurologist left me, which is,
Well, you ran
he would
away. You ran away from your
no, no,
neurologist.
that was the first
Okay.
neurologist. My second neurologist was wonderful, and I was with him for many years, and I would say, you know, Dr. Pilgrim, he should I consider the interferon therapies, and he's like, well, maybe, you seem to be doing fine, and he would have said to me, just keep on doing whatever you're doing.
I'm running.
And since it's working, I'm not going to change anything. It's if it, it appears to have had a profound effect on the course of my illness. And you know, to be clear, the percentage of MS sufferers who have no symptoms is about 4%. So I'm in a very lucky minority there. Um, Yeah. So I wanted to say one more thing because in talking about the 80/20, I actually have a little more data that wasn't just pulled out of a hat. That came from a study that was released last summer. I think it was Australian, and they were kind of looking at the impact of diet and uh, exercise and trying to sort of assess a value to it. It ended up getting sort of a lot of press as you can't you even if you run, you can't outrun the ill effects of a poor diet. But in fact, what the study showed was that the amount of change that you could affect by exercising was way greater than any improvements to your diet, which were incremental. And so by looking at that, I could actually see, exercise made it improved it 5 times as much, whereas diet was only, say, one time or 2 times. So in looking at that data, that was where I kind of came down with the 80/20.
In my journey, I used to say all the time, you can't exercise your way out of a bad diet. Um, I've somewhat evolved my thinking there, in that I still think food is the foundation, that you have to have the basics down um, to some degree. I don't think we subscribe to the Twinkies all day diet. So if you can establish that foundation, that baseline, if you will, then the rest may not matter as much. And then you can exercise your way out of a lot.
Absolutely. I totally agree. And so enjoy an occasional Twinkie. Yeah. Don't, not Twinkies,
Well, there are
Twinkies
better
all day
options.
long.
There's so many better options out there. I would say the processed food has gotten so much better in the last few years. There's so many great, innovative new companies that have better for you ingredients, ranging from the Unreals and the Justins on the peanut butter cup, like Hue chocolate. There's just so many better options with processed food. And they taste good.
Are you dissing Twinkie?
I just was never into Twinkies. They kind of gross me out. I'm a chocolate peanut butter guy at heart. And the good news is I have done the experiments where wore the continuous glucose monitors, and I'd monitor my blood sugar, and it's actually negligible. So like chocolate and peanut butter do nothing for, in terms of which was like, oh, this is amazing. I can eat these things all day if I wanted to. Negligible.
So how much exercise are you doing a day? Because now I feel like there's a million things I should have said. Oops, it's 2 more minutes. But
Phil, go ahead. We have more time if you want.
the quick thing is, of course, you once you exercise, it increases your metabolism, and all those effects are lasting. They trail off over the next 24 hours. So if you exercise every day, your body is in this constantly revved up state, which means you can eat a bunch of peanut butter cups and not impact your glucose.
That is true, but I can also eat other things that will impact my blood sugar levels. And I used to do all sorts of fun experiments when I wore that thing, but I don't wear it anymore. In terms of what I do every day, I'm a huge walker, so I'm always moving. I have a rule: if it's less than 5 flights, I take the stairs. I do some strength training, but I'm always moving. I have to move. So I am definitely not sedentary. So I like 10,000 steps a day, easy, always moving. So coming back to, so many interesting studies and anecdotes you referenced during the course of this interview. Is there anything that's on the horizon or that you're excited about?
Oh my gosh. See, it's like I feel like I don't know how we could have spoken for an hour and a half, and I still feel like there's so much left
Well,
out.
we can go. We can keep going.
So yeah, of course. I mentioned it in the last chapter, which is there is this amazing, huge study being done at the National Institutes of Health, the molecular transducers of physical activity in humans. It's a multi-institutional project. It was supposed to take 5 years, but it's been delayed a little by the pandemic. It's being done. There's different components. There's laboratory research and there's clinical research on animals and humans. And right before the book was published, I interviewed a couple of the scientists about some of the early results on animals. And that was super fascinating. So, in what this study is trying to do, I should have mentioned, is actually inventory all of the molecules that are created by physical activity to understand what they're doing, and then of course to figure out which ones are most beneficial and how we might be able to affect those. So what they found in the work with animals was two really interesting things. One is that there's actually a sex difference in the impact of physical activity. So that's something that we're going to want to be thinking about, just as we think about different dosages for medications.
So what was the sex difference?
It did just different impacts of the different levels on male and female bodies. So it might be less, or you could have a greater impact, say, with on the male body than on the female body, or you might have you could achieve more with a less investment of time and energy. So um, but so that was one thing. And the other thing was, and this is super important, that exercise affects every single system of the body. It's not just your muscles, your skeletal muscles, and your cardiovascular system. As we all know, it's your brain, your cognitive power, but it's also things you wouldn't think about, like your gut health and your reproductive system. So they found that the beneficial impacts of exercise were just system wide. So it's just another reason to keep exercising.
I love it. Anastacia, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you so much for having me, Jason.